two of our three speakers this afternoon, and I hope it will be my pleasure to introduce the third one in due course. What we're going to do is hear two inputs in this venue, and then the third input's actually going to take place in the auditorium around the corner, because Johan Brink, who's our third presenter, wants to show a couple of slides. He's not here yet, and he's a cardiothoracic surgeon, so I'm hoping that he's getting out of the other theatre to come to this theatre. But first of all, Stan Hinkerman is our first presenter, and he is working at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, and himself is a what should I say? Can I use the word survivor? Or a heart transplant recipient? Is that the correct term? 7 years ago, and has a really fascinating story to tell.
Good afternoon, everybody. Really wonderful to be here. Sometimes one gets attention without looking for it, and certainly my journey over the last 30 years has been a very interesting journey. I categorize the last, say, 20 years of my life into 3 parts. And you would forgive me if I use the heart metaphor. And so I talk about my brave heart phase, and then I talk about my faint heart phase, and the third phase is my new heart phase. And the brave heart phase is pretty much where most of you are at. You're invincible, you can do anything. And I was, and I still am, a keen hiker. And I was on a hike on the 6th of January 2001. Day 1 of a 5-day hike in the Swannenberg Mountains. And within the first hour of that hike, I suffered a massive heart attack. Now, I know heart attacks don't come from nowhere, but that's what it felt like. I didn't think I had prior warning. And there I was on this mountain with 3 young boys, 3 16-year-old boys, one of them being my own son. And, the community that I come from has a history of gang violence and gangsters and so on. And I thought, I want to take this 16-year-old and 2 of his friends into the mountains and sit around the fire every night and talk to them about what it means to be a man. Never got the opportunity. Long story short, I was taken to Swannenberg Hospital and couldn't be moved. Then from there to Eben Donges Hospital in Worcester and couldn't be moved. Stayed there for 5 days and then came to Grooteskiel for 2 more days. And the point I'm making is simply that I started out the journey with the intention of conquering a mountain. Now, that was a no-brainer. 2 weeks before that, I had just finished the Otter Trail with 4 friends. And those of you who know the Otter Trail know that day 4 is notorious because you have to get to the river, And low tide on that particular day was at 5:20 in the morning. So we decided to start walking at 11 o'clock. It was an amazing experience, doing that 10 kilometers with torches and all of that. So just to paint the picture, brave heart, that's what I was. And so I was, on this mission to conquer this mountain, and 7 days later, I get home, and I can't walk 5 steps without gasping for breath. And kind of had a low-level existence for the next 5 years. You know what happened? So that's my faint heart phase. You know what happens when you're sick? You desperately want to be normal, because sick is not normal. You know, you desperately want to be well. You desperately want to do stuff. And when your brain is over there and your body is over here, it's really, really hard. And it's really, you know, a time of great frustration. And then in 2006, I visited my cardiologist, routine visit, but I went to that appointment and I was going to say to him, "Doctor, I can't go on like this." Because I'd reached a stage where just having to get out of my car was an effort. And I had to psych myself up to walk into a shop. And I kind of had a mental picture of what the shop looked like. I knew when I was living alone at the time, knew what I wanted, and just, you know, go and get it and away. So I went onto the waiting list for a transplant. But let me first tell you this, and I'm sure you heard this a lot. When you first hear that you need a new heart, I mean, it boggles the mind. You know, and I remember taking in the information and composing myself while I'm in the room, and I'm leaving the room and phoning somebody, crying, saying they were going to take my heart out. Because it was, you know, I didn't think of it as this organ. It was me. You know, and the heart, obviously, you know, and coming from a very religious background, you know, we hear all kinds of things about the heart from religious people. And so, went onto the waiting list for the first few weeks, waited for that call every day, and then decided, you know what, let's just live. And then 8 months later, I received the call that, you know, you're waiting for, but you never prepared for. I remember it was 11:15 in the evening, and Dr. Kun called. Now, when the doctor calls himself, you know, this is serious. And he says to me, "Stanley, I think we have heart failure." And you get the regime, because, you know, this is an amazing field. Besides being one of the best research fields, you know, my experience has been also that they prepare, especially for something like this, you get prepared so well. Technically, you know what's going to happen. You know how long you're going to be if all things go well. You know what's going to happen and all of that. And so one of the things they told us is that when you receive the call, you have a window period of about 4 hours. And so that's what I'm expecting. So he says to me, "I think we've got a heart failure." But then he says, "But don't rush. You know, the heart will be harvested tomorrow morning. So go and sleep. You try and go to sleep." And so I went into the theater and woke up. And my first awareness was not that I've got a new heart. My first awareness was not the pain. My first awareness was, I can breathe freely. Something I could not do for 6 years. And that for me was an amazing experience. I think these things that we don't even think about. And so started a brand new journey. 2 weeks after I walked into hospital, I walked out of hospital. And so this journey started. Now, you know, you get people who go through the same thing, but they respond very differently to it. And so I know of people who've had transplants who are flourishing, whom I admire greatly. And then there are people who really And sometimes the struggle is physical, but mostly the struggle is psychological. It's mental. And you know, the biggest shift that I had to make was that mental shift. And even though they prepare you, I mean, I was told you're going to feel guilty. I was told that. But you still feel it. You still feel it, you know. Because that's that awareness that I'm alive. And so this gratitude quickly makes way to guilt. I'm alive, but somebody died. And even though you know cognitively you were not responsible, you can't share this. And my personal sense is that the sooner you can get over that, the better. And I had a little experience which I'm happy to share privately with people, because it's a part of my script here. But really changed, you know, my thinking. And so I have this, in fact, I developed it after the heart attack already. I said to myself, I have two choices. I can live in the shadow of a heart attack, or in this case of a heart transplant, or I can live in the victory of my survival. And that's essentially the choice we have to make, you know, when you go through something like this. And so, some of the things, I just want to touch on three things that I think kind of you look at more acutely. And the one is the issue of relationships. Often it takes a crisis to determine the quality of intimate and close relationships. And in most cases, you know, relationships thrive, relationships are strengthened, but in some cases, relationships don't survive it. And sadly, I was in a position where the relationship took a lot of strain. Now, I'm the first to admit that, you know, when you're struggling to survive, you know, you're not in a good space. You know? And so you're not the nicest person to be around, so I admit that. But essentially what happened was that my marriage disintegrated. And so, you know, there is that risk. Because you have different values, you have different priorities. And suddenly, you know, your family sees you as this selfish person. You know. To give a practical example, my wife, I was married to her for 21 years at the time. And for probably 20 of that 21 years, she got coffee in bed every morning. And suddenly I don't drink coffee. And even though she probably understood that physically I was not, but it was difficult for her to comprehend. I'm not saying that's why we divorced, but you know. But suddenly, you know, I come across as selfish. But you know what happens there? It's not just the relationship between other people, it's the relationship with yourself. Because you're in survival mode. And when you're in survival mode, you know, it's a primal instinct. You know, you preserve and conserve your energy. And I judged my days in those sick times by whether I have a slow day or an okay day. Because, you know, it wouldn't have been truthful to talk about good days, because really there weren't many good days. But there were also really amazing relationships that developed out of that. Relationships with my medical team. And, you know, if ever you build up a very strong bond with cardiologists and cardiothoracic surgeons, it's during this time. Because your life is basically in these people's hands, you know. And I often joke and say to Dr. Kuhn that he's one of the few people who had my heart in his hands. But, you know, and so when I still go and visit him, you know, probably 20%, 30% of the time we spend on clinical stuff, the rest we just chat. two of us solved the problems of the world in that time when I sat with you. I had a similar relationship with my cardiologist before the transplant. In fact, when I walked in, and I said to you, I was going to tell him I can't go on anymore. I didn't have to. He looked at me and he said to me, I'll examine you in the ward. And so on. And then that's just two relationships. And so the point I'm making simply is that irrespective of where we are in life, and relationships are key. You know, and so I lost significant relationship. I lost support system, one part of my support system, but I gained so much on the other side. The second thing, and I alluded to this, is the whole issue of scripts. You know, generally the script says that if you had a heart transplant, be careful. You know, don't jeopardize. Now, yes, in principle that's true. But the interpretation of the script can go either way. Because some people go and sit in a corner and say, oh no, I can't do anything. You know, I need to watch this heart. I need to look after this heart. But actually what they're doing is not looking after the heart. They're actually not allowing the heart to thrive. They're not allowing the heart to become part of them, of who they are. And so I decided, because I made the decision to live in the victory of my survival, to really honor my donor and the donor family, and to show my gratitude by living as full a life as possible. And so I do a lot of work for the Organ Donor Foundation, a lot of awareness work on radio, and so forth and so on. But I also joined the South African Transplant Sports Association. And you are now looking at we had the World Transplant Games last year. We're looking at the SA captain. South Africa came third out of 49 countries. And I'm also involved in the administration of the sport and so on. And then I just want to say in closing, because I'd rather ask questions, that the one thing that I really, really appreciate about this second chance is that, you know, I'm fortunate because not everybody gets a second chance. There are many people who wait and never receive. And so my life is a life of gratitude, but also it's a life of service. And I'm not saying I'm Mother Teresa incarnated, but I have this commitment to not only live for myself, but live for my country, for my community. And that's why I work at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, where I head up a program called Building an Inclusive Society. I'm passionate about this country. And if we're going to leave it to the politicians, we're not going to have a country. If we're going to leave it to the extremists on all sides, we're not going to have a country. It's people like you and I who have to strengthen that middle ground. And if the middle ground gives way, you know, because that's what keeps this country going. And so my gratitude also extends to my service to my country. Thank you.
I don't have anything to do with cardiothoracic medicine or surgery. But what I teach is magic. This is magic. It's not science. This museum is constituted around a very, very different idea from the one it's pretending to put before the public. We transplant eyes, we transplant hair, we transplant all kinds of things. We don't make museums for that. And South Africa is a provincial backwater and so on and so forth. And when Christian Barnard did his spectacular thing in 1967, we had every reason to punt this as hard as we could in the world. We were, after all, the pariah of the post-Sharpeville and near the Soweto kind of world. So we needed a leverage. There are reasons that we might fetishize the heart thing, but the way this grabs the imagination has to do with something else, as we all know. And it's because it's this thing, it's the heart, rather than anything else. The entire museum is constituted around a magical principle, several magical principles which are deeply important for those of us with an anthropological interest in what's going on here. This diorama is iconostatic. It belongs as a contemplative artifice in an iconostasis, a panoply of contemplative kind of images for our consideration. But the word stasis that's in there is a tremendously important one. One of the first things you notice here is that no one's moving. They're not moving anywhere. And as the great critic, novelist, thinker John Berger points out about photographs, as a static representation of something, is ripped from the fabric of time. Absolutely and utterly taken out of time. We are piling away from this event at the speed of light, just as Einstein said we would, and that clock's going to stay at 2 to 6 forever. We are at, and this is what's so extraordinary about the thing, we're not in just a museum, we are at the place where the event happened. The museum is constituted on the site. And we know other very good examples of that around the world. The most obvious one is a place which takes its name from the site where the Americans detonated the first atomic weaponry in the Nevadan desert, called Ground Zero, and which has translocated itself in popular conception to any place where it happens, whether those be the thousands of roadside shrines with wreaths and crosses that decorate the South African landscape alongside the roads, or anywhere else in the world for that matter, or whether it's the site of the World Trade Center collapse and the Ground Zero monument that's going up, or the Ground Zero that's right here, because this is what happened. We're in a sort of the holy constitutions of space before an iconostasis. And we're asked here, really, to contemplate something that Johan doesn't deal in, which is vitalism, which is that whole metaphoric complex of the blood and the heart as the location in a false materialist cosmology of the soul, some pneumatic concept of the self, alien to modern science, alien to Buddhism for that matter, and so on, but deeply, deeply held by the Judeo-Christian tradition, as Stan was suggesting. And it's a very, very powerful concept. Johan's got an image that he procured in Egypt some time ago, and it's around the corner in a passage, which shows the human heart being weighed alongside a feather for the massive sin in it, in an Egyptian representation of the afterlife of the soul. Here we've got something that should be representing science, and I can construe it. I'm sure that the cardiothoracic surgeon will correct me, but I'm imagining this is a measure of the displacement of blood in order to compute blood loss or whatever. You measure the tau before and after. But it looks like a heart, for heaven's sake, and it's red, and it's all hanging here, and we're constituted in a colour scheme that is what we call heliogabalic, after the name of the Roman emperor, Heliogabalus, who liked to slit the throats of his victims on green grass, so you could see the colour red run on green, which makes one wonder why scrubs used to be green and blue more nowadays, aren't they? But in the old days they were green, and I guess the scientists are going to say because it offers this contrast. After all, these are this traditional contrast. But the last thing you actually want is contrast to the blood. You don't want blood anywhere in the process at all. You need the contrast. The last thing you want is strange. This image is familiar to you. You've seen this lighting, which they can say is science, and we all stared up into the dentist's camera, or had our brows stroked by climanesthetists as we went under for adenoids, or hearts, or whatever the case was. But this drop light constitutes the lighting that we see in Western art in particular, and called chiaroscuro, shadow and light, death and life. The moment in the stasis between the darkness out of which beads sparrow flies into the light of the hall, in one of the oldest metaphors in English culture. Life is like a sparrow flown out of darkness, briefly in the hall, where the knights and their ladies sit cavorting and then flies back up. What would we give to know of the darkness? And where to go? Because ripped out of time, as we say, between a heartbeat, hers and his, some truth lies. This sort of oracular density that attends the place, peculiar and strange. That chiaroscuro we've seen in Caravaggio's Supper at Emmaus. There's a picture gathered around Christ's representing the miracle. It's more important for our purposes constituted in Rembrandt's famous The Anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp. which shows a group of Netherlandish worthies gathered around a body like this, looking at it in this kind of a light, which is an optimal kind of a light. But Rembrandt's already distancing us, and he's showing us something strange. That light, that pillar, that column of light is falling on where we think relocate life itself. And it's a peculiar thing. Or you've seen it in Joseph Wright of Derby, a famous picture called The Experiment with the Air Pump, where you've got people constituted around the same light, and there's this guy who's pumping the air out of this vacuum flask, in which lies a dove. Okay? And the dove's doing what you do if you pump air out of it, and a woman's leading away because the light itself is being taken up. But it's the same concentricity, the circle, and it goes back to a lot of magical notions. Weave a circle round him thrice, for he on honeydew hath fed and drunk the milk of paradise. Chris, I'm going to see this extraordinary figure. I just want to frame it that way. There are other things. Welland Stithy, the old, the ironmongery here recapitulating that extraordinary power of the metallurgical magic in humankind, the light of the forge and so on. It's all reconstituted in this way. Yeah, it's just as it was, except it isn't. And there's a clue to the way it was. When you walk out, look into the eyes of each of these individuals. They're all not in this time at all. Even though they're glass, our eyes projected will see out of them. The old idea was that love and all these things was through the eyes, a stream of photons running down to where Plato, but mostly Aristotle, constituted the heart as the site. Not so much of the emotions, the affect, as the mind in those old days. But the idea is all through human civilization. Less so in some cultures than in other cultures. I don't think we find that your Xhosa culture with its I'm just trying to summon is that important, although at the sacrifice of a bull or any cow in Xhosa culture, there is the grabbing of the umpire or the altar and so on and so forth. There's some sense of the concentricity of life. But the point that I hope we're going to get this conversation to widen and widen towards, and I'm using that term importantly, is the way in which that concept of heart's centrality has spilt into the metaphoric complex of all the European languages and many others as well. In the European tradition, that happens chiefly because Plato, before Aristotle and then Galen or whatever, constitute the kind of wrong medicine of the heart, and this materialist sort of location of this immaterial idea of the spirit in this, what Chris Barnard says, just a pump. Really? Plato, in broad terms, donates us a way of thinking of microcosm and macrocosm and so on and so forth, which is still prevalent everywhere. And it allows us very easily in the English and European languages to shuttle from one concept across others and to replicate the metaphorical analogous purport of something to everywhere. This heart is at the center of this body. This body is at the center of this circle. This circle is at the center of this room. This room is at the center of this hospital. This hospital, this museum tells us, is at the center of Cape Town. This is the heart of Cape Town, apparently. Okay? And so on and so forth. And we use that all the time. When we think of literature, we have heart of darkness, we have the heart of redness, we have the heart of the matter, we have in the heart of the country. You can't stop finding a major author who hasn't gone to the heart of something. That's what we do. We locate things at hearts. It's our idiomatic knee-jerk or heartbeat of affect towards the centrality of things. To such an extent that it's really, really difficult not to feel that the heart is the self. Someone is beating in you. To remind yourself that it is just a pump, a rather hard piece of thing. I remember the great Czechoslovakian poet Miroslav Holub came out to Cape Town in the last years of his life. He's a medical doctor, an immunologist. This was in the late 90s, and I went to listen to him and interview him. And I remember him standing up and saying, the heart, yes, it's just a pump. If you insist, he said, it's not a very good pump. Humankind knows of at least 4 better models of pumps, whatever. I remember thinking that was, oh my God. Because Galen said, Galen who reconstituted Aristotle for 1.5 millennia dominated the Western thought about it. Galen was a teleological thinker. He said that the heart any organ in the body is the quintessence of its perfection, is the summation we read back from its perfection. How to deal with it, how to treat it, how to manage it, how to medicine it. And then we don't push it forward. The step where you start saying, no, that pump's not working anymore, or it may be something else, that valve can be rethought by somebody else. So it's a drastic way of thinking. So that Neoplatonic kind of concentricity, what we call emanations and iterations of an idea across hundreds of things. We go to the heart of the reading we've got to do for Wednesday. You know what I mean? We stand at the heart of buildings. We call, we call puddings hearts of something. They're everywhere. We've come up with iconic representations that don't really look terribly much to look like a heart. Feminists say they look like something else, masquerading as hearts. And we should duly avoid them. But you can buy balloons shaped like that, and so on and so forth. It's true. A bottom and stuff looks much more like a heart. So there's sexualization. That is a cascade of kind of complicating thoughts, which are there now for compost for you, and it's your job to check up sunflowers in your questions.
First of all, again, just responding to Stan, we as doctors are in a very, and there are doctors in the audience as well, we're in a very privileged situation of being able to help patients. I mean, it's a great privilege to be able to help people like Stan with a heart transplant, and it's still one of the most dramatic. I'm a heart surgeon. Most of my work is not transplanting hearts. I love to do that when we have them, but donor shortages are a limiting factor. But still, one of the nicest ways, one of the most rewarding things that I do are heart transplants, because you do have patients that are waiting for a long time. You develop a special relationship with them, much more so than with other patients, because they become our lifelong patients. They are as healthy as you might see Stan is, but they are dependent on medication, much like a very well-controlled diabetic. They need to take medication, and they need the expertise of a team who deals with them. So I'm very privileged to be in that situation, to help people like Stan. It's not my patient, but I have many hundreds of patients over the last 30 years that I've been involved in heart transplantation. Relationships were important, what you were saying. You know, the relationships that we see in families, we build up relationships not just with the patient, but with the whole family. Patients on average wait about 6 months for a heart. I think that's 8 months you waited. That's an average, but it depends upon various circumstances. I've had patients for 3 years and multiple telephone calls, waiting for a transplant, get called in and then to find something wrong. One of the funniest ones I've had, actually, a bit, in retrospect, a bit hilarious, was once we were going to transplant a patient and got as far as getting him into theatre and actually started the skin incision when things went wrong with the donor and we had to cancel the operation. And as I came out of theatre, the family was standing there and I had to tell them, I said, look, I'm very sorry. And of course everybody was disappointed. The patient came through that sort of false operation quite well. And a month later we got the true operation. The donor worked and we did the transplant a month later on the patient. And when I came out of theatre, the family was standing there and I said, all's gone well, the transplant's gone well. And the family said, has he had the transplant? I said, yes. He said, are you sure? I'll never forget that. And, sort of feeling that. And then I realized that I remembered that a month or 6 weeks earlier he'd come in and not have a transplant. So it's still one of the funniest things, are you sure? And I wanted to say, well, what do you think I've been doing for the last 5 or 6 hours?
You had the skin incision the first time?
Yeah, we got that far. We try not to, but things can go wrong. And patients are warned, I'm sure you're warned, that there are false alarms and, you know, that you get called. And that's a terrible disappointment. That's a terrible stress in the family. Some patients are awake outside Cape Town. They come through in the middle of the night and to be told when they land shortly afterwards that things haven't worked out. You know, that's just the way it is. Now, I thought I'd tell you a little bit more. I personally would prefer to have a sort of interaction meeting with you. I mean, Steve had asked me to give a bit of didactic stuff on valves, for example, but there's so many things we could talk about. And I would like to comment a little bit about Peter's talk, because it's something, I find it very fascinating. And it's a concept that I sometimes think about. But, you know, we stand here, we're not, it's not a, you know, this is my working environment. This is how we work. And of course, I was very instrumental in turning this into a museum because of the great public interest. But I'll come back to that a little bit. just about the museum, in case you're not aware, or maybe it's been told you, but this is actually where the transplant took place. Exactly, well, it's now almost 46, 47 years ago. The time the clock was stopped at that time, that's when the donor, that's when the operation finished on the Sunday morning. This was and I was thinking of this, the arts and medicine, that this was the most publicized medical event of all time. There's been nothing ever since. I think if one day there was a brain transplant, I think that would get the same sort of. I mean, it was an absolute media frenzy at the time. I was in school at the time, and I just remember we didn't have television in South Africa then, but the TV crews came in their hordes from overseas. The media, front page news everywhere, and they appeared on Life magazine, Time magazine, Newsweek, all the big papers, and then all the foreign ones, the Figaro and all Paris Match. It was just the most publicized event. I mean, one of the most publicized events ever, but certainly for the most medical publicized event. There was a fairly similar one about when they did the first mechanical heart, Dr. De Vries. This was in the 80s. I happened to be working in America at the time. And that was quite well publicized, but it was nothing like this. And then there was the baby Faye transplant, where a little chimpanzee, I think it was chimpanzee heart, was put into a little baby by Leonard Bailey. And that was unfortunately unsuccessful, and we know now that it's going to be a long time before we can use other species of heart to transplant. But that was also some of you might remember that was also made the press in quite big ways. But the first heart transplant was really the only other things that I can remember that were as memorable in my time at the time was obviously when man went to the moon, which was a very, very similar time period. I think it was 66. And then the assassination of Kennedy, that was equally worldwide news. And then in South Africa, locally, the assassination of Hendrik Verwoerd. That happened also at that time. And these things I remember as a kid. So it was quite a time. When we moved from this hospital, I did my training here as a surgeon. This was a working theatre then, in the late 70s, early 80s. And at the end of 1980s, we moved to the new hospital. Brand new system, things were very old-fashioned here. And at the time, there was a lot of call from the public and others that we should turn this into a museum. And for the same reasons that Peter was saying, all sorts of reasons why this should be made a museum, because it was the site was such a, as you said, ground zero, where it all happened. And there was a tremendous amount of public interest. When I was a student and later, a lot of friends and people used to visit South Africa, can you take them to the, where was the first transplant done? So we turned this into a museum. We didn't have any funds. But we looked around for funds, and what we did was we took down, this was a false ceiling with new air conditioning that had been put in the 70s. We looked that all up, we put back this gallery that you see here. This was the way medical students before my time, you would learn. They'd stand on the gallery there. I don't know how you actually learned anything, but that's how it was. My parents were also, my parents were in the same class as Chris Barner, and they would sit in the gallery like this and watch the operation. But that was 30 years earlier. How you learn anything, I don't know. But that was all taken down in the 70s. Modern air conditioning was put in, the ceiling went to that level. And then I'd like to get to just sort of talk a little bit about what Peter was saying. I also, he said it already, so I'm not going to say it again, but the heart is just a pump. That was Chris Barnard's big thing. It's just a pump. It's a very sophisticated pump. It does break down, unfortunately, and that gives me a job to try and fix it most of the time. Or, if anything, everything fails, then to replace the heart. But I think it's more than that. I mean, Peter's told you, it's a seat of emotions. I mean, if you read, there's so much written in art and in the literature about the heart. It's got nothing to do with its pumping function. It's a seat of our emotions. It's the organ that represents life more than anything else. Certainly the brain is a lot more of a sophisticated organ. And that's really where our thoughts are, and that's what makes us human. But the heart is really the symbol. And so I don't think it's just a pump. I mean, I work on the pump aspect of it. But it means a lot more, symbolizes a lot more. It symbolizes health. And Stan has really explained that very much. And I think you can see how well and healthy he is. But how, with the failing heart, how terribly limited he was. And how grateful he is, and what, of getting a new heart and a new chance. So these are the things that I'd like to make you think about and consider.
Questions?
Yeah, we've just had, just from our own point of view, we've had 3 recent successes. We've just transplanted our 500 and 501st patients in the last 3 months, and they're both doing well. You might have seen that in the press. We've also had our first 2 female patients who've given birth to children. Again, they all happened in February. We haven't had
Post-transplant.
Post-transplant, yeah. Transplant patients. Because the whole point of transplant is to turn patients back, to give them a normal role in society, to have them have an absolutely normal life. And you can see Stan's living a more than normal life, and doing more than most of us do for our community and society. But that includes, in women, it includes childbearing. So we're quite keen. There are problems with it. It's not a simple, straightforward pregnancy. And the type of drugs we use, etc., have to be monitored. So those were 2 successes for us. There are not that many patients worldwide, females, who've gone through uneventful pregnancies. And then a rather sad event, but something that we celebrate, is that we've just unfortunately lost the world's longest surviving transplant, 34 years following his transplant. Paul Thiessen's his name. He is well known. He's always been, like Stan, a promoter of transplantation. He's wanted people to know things. He's also led a much more active life than most of us. He's parachuted. He's been a game ranger. He's had malaria twice. He did motocross cycling. He broke his elbow, broken his hip. He's been a game ranger. He's been an entrepreneur, an amazing person. And unfortunately, he had a rather sad mode of death. He was assaulted just after Christmas and died, but with a healthy heart.